So Pennsylvania State Senator and former nominee for governor Doug Mastriano is, quote, praying about a Senate run against Democrat incumbent Bob Casey in 2024. Now, Mastriano was the same nominee for governor that lost by 15 points to Josh Shapiro back in November and arguably brought down Dr. Oz and other Republicans down with him. So I think this is sort of illustrating a broader problem in the Republican electorate in general of sort of getting behind these fringe and extreme candidates who throw a lot of red meat at the base, are very popular with the base, but ultimately have no appeal to anybody else. And I think Doug Mastriano is exhibit A of that type of candidate. And Doug Mastriano was so extreme that he even turned off a lot of just normal Republicans, especially in the suburbs around Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, to the point where they were just voting for Shapiro because they viewed Doug Mastriano as a dangerous candidate. So we're going to get into all of this. We'll talk about Doug Mastriano's potential bid for Senate and what that ultimately means for the GOP and how others are responding to it. But of course, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So Doug Mastriano is, as I mentioned, the former nominee for governor. He was giving an interview, which is pretty rare considering that Doug Mastriano almost never talks to media. He'll talk to OAN or very right-wing outlets, but he normally never talks to any mainstream media whatsoever. But he was quoted as saying, in regards to his future political endeavors, what do you do with the movement of 2.2 million, referring to the amount of people that voted for him back in the fall? He said, quote, we're keeping it alive, which means that he really wants to sort of continue his involvement in politics to the dismay of many on the Republican side. So he continues in the bottom, quote, we've seen people in the past, other Republican gubernatorial candidates, they rise and they disappear when they lose. Why, he asked. You have people that love and support you. So he's sort of arguing that he sort of built this grassroots movement in the Pennsylvania GOP, and it's something he certainly wants to continue. Now, if we go back to his actual campaign back in November, by any metric, it was a total disaster. Doug Mastriano couldn't really raise any money. He had no TV ads until the very end and barely attracted crowds of people. The people he mostly attracted were the diehards in the sort of Trump base, the people that he sort of pandered to with his Stop the Steal rhetoric. His position on abortion, which was running ads continuously throughout Pennsylvania, was effectively that he believed women who had abortions should be charged with murder. And regardless of your opinion on abortion, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, that is an incredibly toxic opinion. And even a lot of pro-life people would very much disagree with that approach. But nonetheless, these were Doug Mastriano's positions, and it made him electorally toxic in the state of Pennsylvania. So much so that he did historically bad, in my opinion, given some of the margins in some of these counties. Now, again, as I mentioned, he lost by 14.8, effectively 15 points. He almost lost historically Republican Lancaster County, which has been one of the most solid Republican counties throughout Pennsylvania, literally since the beginning of the Republican Party. This county has only voted for the Democrats a handful of times. Almost went to Josh Shapiro. Luzerne County, which was a safe Trump county, went to Josh Shapiro. Cumberland County, a county that Donald Trump won by a little over 10 percentage points, went to Josh Shapiro. And I could go on and on. But ultimately, Doug Mastriano completely collapsed throughout the entire state of Pennsylvania and brought everybody else down with him. The rest of the delegation that was running, the state senators, the state house members, obviously Dr. Oz, who was also running on this exact same ballot, were dragged down by it. Now, there was a lot of split ticketing in this race, and you could argue, well, Oz wasn't dragged down because a lot of people decided to split their tickets. I mean, if you take a look at this, there were over 200,000 people that voted for Dr. Oz that also voted for Josh Shapiro. That's a big number. But you have to consider that Doug Mastriano's extreme positions likely also brought out Democratic voters who were apathetic about voting, who weren't planning on voting in the first place, that ultimately ended up to come out and vote against Doug Mastriano, and by extension, since they're Democrats, voted for Fetterman and the other down-ballot candidates. So I think, if anything, Doug Mastriano scared out the Democratic electorate in a way that some generic Republican like Lou Barletta or somebody else would not have. Now, I think it's very easy to argue that any of the other candidates running for governor, Lou Barletta, Dave White, McSwain, that they probably would have lost, but they probably wouldn't have lost by this colossal of a margin. I think somebody like Barletta probably would have lost by 8, and I think that would have given Dr. Oz much more of a fighting chance, although arguably Oz had his own problems in the Senate race as well. But, you know, going up against Bob Casey, Doug Mastriano is probably the worst candidate to do that, because you would effectively be putting him up as a sacrificial lamb. And some people's argument is, well, if Doug Mastriano wants to run, let him run. But the problem with that is, for the Republicans, Doug Mastriano is going to have a negative effect on the ballot like he did in 2022. And again, probably turn out a lot of people to come and vote against him. You don't lose by 15 points by being a generic Republican in Pennsylvania. This was a state that almost voted for Donald Trump back in 2020. Donald Trump only lost Pennsylvania by 1.2%. So you're talking pretty much a 13, 14-point shift to the left in just 2 years. And obviously it's an off-year midterm. Josh Shapiro was a pretty good candidate in hindsight. Again, back during the 2022 midterms, my analysis on this race was very different because, quite frankly, I didn't know a lot of things about Doug Mastriano. I didn't know a lot of his positions. Of course, him being at the Capitol on January 6th was a huge red flag to a lot of moderate and suburban voters, you know, in and around Philadelphia. And that just sort of reinforced the narrative that he was this sort of deranged extremist that he was painted as. So, of course, obviously him running is going to make a lot of Republicans very nervous about what their prospects are in Pennsylvania because, again, Mastriano did not win the primary by a majority. He got about 44% in the primary, but he speaks for a sizable minority of the Republican base that don't care about whether or not Doug Mastriano can win. They'll vote for him because they think he's the person that best represents their values. It doesn't matter if he wins a general election or not. Now, this mentality is very different from the Democratic base back in 2020, who were all about electability. They chose Joe Biden because they believed he was the best candidate to beat Trump. Now, obviously, the Pennsylvania Republicans did not choose Mastriano because they thought he'd be the best candidate to beat Josh Shapiro. They chose him because he espoused their values most closely. As I mentioned before, Bob Casey is an incredibly strong candidate. A lot of the big politicos have already labeled this race as either lean or likely Democrat, and I've put this race as likely Democrat since Bob Casey, while he hasn't officially announced, is expected to, though Bob Casey is facing some health issues, so he might decide not to run. But either way, this is a race that probably leans towards the Democrats anyway, just given the fact that Pennsylvania is a state that leans towards the Dems. But I can guarantee you if Doug Mastriano is the nominee that he'll probably lose by anywhere from 15 to 20 points, and this won't be a remotely competitive race. Now, again, Casey is a really strong candidate. Back in 2018, he was able to beat Lou Barletta by over 13 percentage points. Again, this was right after Pennsylvania voted for Donald Trump by 0.7 just 2 years before it. Of course, back in 2012, Bob Casey beat his opponent by about 9 points. Despite Romney only losing the state by 5. So Bob Casey's an outperformer. He's a household name in Pennsylvania. He's going to be incredibly hard to beat, even for the most talented Republican candidate. Even if you got a Republican and put him in a lab and made him the best cookie-cutter Republican to run in Pennsylvania, it would still be an uphill battle because the Casey name holds a lot of weight in Pennsylvania. Bob Casey Sr., obviously Bob Casey's father, was the former governor of Pennsylvania, incredibly popular, and of course that Casey dynasty is really strong in Pennsylvania, so anybody running against Casey is going to have an incredibly difficult time. It's not impossible. I've said before, he is a beatable incumbent, but it's incredibly, incredibly hard to do it. Now, going back to Mastriano, Steve Daines, the chair of the NRSC, which is in charge of fundraising and recruiting candidates for Senate on the Republican side, had a statement in regards to Mastriano's potential bid. He basically said, quote, "We need somebody who can win a primary and a general election. His last race demonstrated he can't win a general." So that's a pretty blunt way of saying Doug Mastriano can't win and I won't be supporting him. Now, I think by Steve Daines, this is a very good move. So far, Steve Daines has been a very effective chair of the NRSC, and I want to make a video covering that in the future because I think he's made a number of really smart calls already, which bodes very well for Republicans' prospects in the Senate. Again, the Senate really should be a given for Republicans, given the map that they have. I mean, they're basically at 52 seats, given Montana, Ohio, and West Virginia. These are states they should win really easily. Obviously, it's going to be a bit harder with those Democratic incumbents, but nonetheless, this is a year in the Senate where Republicans should be doing very well, and Doug Mastriano is basically the type of person that gets in the way of that. He's not somebody who can win a general election. He's a fringe extreme candidate to most Americans. That's how most Americans will view him. Most Pennsylvanians will view him. They've already rejected him by a whopping 15 points last November. This would be an objectively terrible idea to run somebody like Doug Mastriano. And this goes for a lot of the candidates that got destroyed in the midterms last time around. Tudor Dixon, Christina Caramo, the Secretary of State nominee in Michigan, who's now the chairwoman of the Michigan GOP, so on and so forth. There's a number of candidates that I think, if Republicans were smart, would be pushed into the electoral dustbin of history and not talked about again. But anyway, that's just my 2 cents on the Mastriano potential Senate run. I think it's a terrible idea, and ultimately Republicans need to get very smart and strategic about the candidates that they recruit. Anyway, thanks for watching this video. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe if you enjoyed. Like this video down below if you enjoyed. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.